She sat in the back row, a quiet anomaly among towering giants. They assumed her silence meant weakness, a predictable trait for a fragile earthling. They were incredibly wrong. When violence erupted and claws flashed in Classroom 4, Abigail Miller did not scream or run. She simply locked the door. To understand what happened in Classroom 4B, you first have to understand the impossible weight resting on Abigail Miller's shoulders. She was 16 years old, standing a perfectly average 5'4", with pale skin, a smattering of freckles, and a messy bun of ash blonde hair. Among the student body of the Apex Interstellar Academy, she looked like a porcelain doll accidentally dropped into a cage of wild bears. Thanks to the Academy's standard-issue neural translation matrix, the unpronounceable clicks, growls, and subharmonic frequencies of her alien peers were automatically localized into standard Western names for her brain to process. It made the terrifying environment slightly more surreal. The 9-foot-tall reptilian behemoth with 4 arms and razor-sharp dorsal ridges was named Gideon. The sleek, multi-eyed insectoid who sat next to her in astrophysics was Chloe. But a familiar name did not equate to a familiar nature. The Academy was the most prestigious educational facility in the Orion Spur, built for the elite offspring of apex species. Humans had only recently discovered faster-than-light travel, and humanity's inclusion in the galactic community was tenuous at best. Abigail was the first human exchange student, a political experiment designed to see if the soft, squishy bipeds from the newly discovered Sol system could survive integration. For Abigail, this wasn't about galactic politics. It was about survival, and it was deeply, painfully personal. Back in Orem, Utah, her father, William Miller, was drowning in agricultural debt. When a catastrophic blight wiped out their family's synthetic wheat crops, a predatory private equity firm, Harrison and Caldwell, moved in to foreclose on the farm that had been in their family for 3 generations. The Interstellar Exchange Scholarship came with a staggering familial stipend of 2 million galactic credits, more than enough to clear the debt, pay for her mother Martha's mounting medical bills, and secure their future. But the contract had a brutal stipulation. If Abigail was expelled, provoked a diplomatic incident, or failed her courses, the stipend would be instantly revoked, and the family would be heavily fined. She had been explicitly warned by Earth's diplomatic liaison before she boarded the shuttle. You are a guest. You will be bullied. You will be tested. Keep your head down, Abigail. Do not fight back. If you throw a punch, you ruin it for all of humanity, and your family loses everything. So, Abigail kept her head down. She wore her thick-rimmed glasses, carried her datapad pressed tightly to her chest, and took the abuse. And the abuse was relentless. Earth, unbeknownst to the galactic community, was what xenobiologists classified as a class, 9 death world. It had crushing gravity, volatile weather, predatory microbes, and apex predators that hunted for sport. The Academy, built to accommodate a wide variety of species, was maintained at a standard 0.4 Earth gravity. To prevent herself from accidentally bounding into the ceiling or crushing a fragile datapad, Abigail wore heavy kinetic dampener bracelets on her wrists and ankles. To the other students, the heavy metal rings looked like medical braces for a crippled, weak creature. Gideon was the worst of them all. His species, an aggressive territorial race of scaled bipeds, valued dominance above all else. To him, Abigail was a walking insult, a soft, flesh-covered prey animal occupying a seat at a predator's table. During the 3rd week of the semester, Gideon had cornered her in the crystalline corridors of the cafeteria. He had casually flicked his lower left hand, striking Abigail's tray. Her nutrient paste and water shattered across the pristine floor. "Watch your step, fleshbag," Gideon had hissed, his localized voice dripping with a deep, guttural superiority. "Your fragile bones might snap if you slip." The surrounding students, Chloe, a massive avian named Arthur, and a gelatinous giant named Simon, had watched in varying states of amusement and apathy. Abigail had simply dropped to her knees, her face burning hot with humiliation, and gathered the broken pieces of her tray. "Don't react," she had told herself, biting her lower lip so hard she tasted copper. "Think of Dad. Think of the farm. Think of Dr. Christopher at Utah Valley Hospital and the surgeries Mom needs. Just breathe." She didn't tell Gideon about the time she was 12 years old, hiking alone in the Wasatch Mountains back home. She didn't tell him about the mountain lion that had stalked her or how it had ambushed her near a dry creek bed. She didn't mention the 3 weeks she spent in the intensive care unit, or the deep, jagged scars that crawled up her left shoulder and back, scars earned while she beat the 150-pound apex predator to death with a heavy steel flashlight because her survival instinct had overridden her fear. Gideon thought she was prey. He had no idea that on Earth, humans were the monsters hiding in the dark. For 3 months, Abigail endured. She maintained a perfect academic record, quietly absorbing knowledge about hyperlane navigation, quantum field dynamics, and interspecies diplomacy. She became a ghost, fading into the background of the sprawling high-tech academy. She spoke only when called upon, walked softly, and never made eye contact with the larger, aggressive species. But a ghost can only remain invisible for so long before the living force it into the light. It was a Tuesday, during a double period of applied xenodynamics. The classroom was a vast amphitheater-style room with tiered seating to accommodate the varying sizes of the students. Professor Benjamin, an elderly, multi-limbed academic with a surprisingly gentle demeanor, was demonstrating the volatile nature of plasma core destabilization at the front of the room. Abigail was in her usual spot, the very back row, tucked into a corner, her kinetic dampeners humming softly against her wrists. The tension in the room had been thick since the moment the bell rang. Gideon was in a foul mood. His species experienced seasonal hormonal spikes, a period of hyperaggression intended for securing mating rights and territory. In a civilized setting, they were supposed to take suppressants, but Gideon arrogantly refused, believing his natural urges made him superior. Directly in front of Gideon sat Simon. Simon was a gentle, herbivorous giant from a peaceful agri-world. He stood 7 feet tall and resembled a heavily armored rhinoceros, but his species was entirely pacifistic, lacking any biological instinct for combat. About halfway through Professor Benjamin's lecture, Simon accidentally shifted in his seat, knocking his heavy tail against Gideon's desk. It was a minor infraction, a simple slip of spatial awareness. Gideon snapped. With a terrifying, high-pitched roar that bypassed the translation matrix and rattled Abigail's eardrums, Gideon stood up. His 4 massive, muscular arms flexed, and the dorsal ridges along his spine flared a vibrant, toxic purple. "You clumsy, pathetic herd animal," Gideon snarled, grabbing Simon by the thick armor plating on his shoulders. I apologize, Gideon," Simon stammered, raising his large, blunt hands in a universal gesture of surrender. "It was an accident. The seating is cramped. Your existence is an accident." Before Professor Benjamin could even shout a warning, Gideon hauled Simon out of his chair with terrifying strength. He slammed the heavy herbivore against the reinforced glass of the classroom window. The entire room shook. A collective gasp echoed from the other 30 students, but nobody moved. In galactic society, interfering with a dominant predator's territorial dispute was considered a suicidal breach of natural law. "Gideon, unhand him immediately!" Professor Benjamin shouted, his multiple limbs trembling as he activated his desk's emergency console. "I am calling the disciplinary wardens!" "Call them!" Gideon barked, his eyes rolling back to reveal completely black sclera, a sign of total feral regression. "By the time they get here, I'll have taught this walking vegetable a permanent lesson in hierarchy." Gideon drew back his upper right fist, which was covered in thick, keratinous knuckles, and drove it directly into Simon's face. The sickening crack of bone echoing in the silent room made Abigail flinch. Simon let out a pitiful, high-pitched wail and collapsed to the floor, clutching his face as dark blue fluid began to pool on the pristine white tiles. Gideon wasn't finished. Lost in a biological frenzy, he stepped forward, raising his heavy, clawed foot to stomp down on Simon's exposed neck. A blow like that, even to an armored species, would be lethal. In the back row, Abigail froze. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. "Do not fight back. You ruin it for all of humanity. You lose the farm." She looked at Simon, cowering on the floor, weeping in terror. She looked at the other students, Arthur, Chloe, and a dozen others, who were literally paralyzed by their evolutionary programming, instinctively freezing to avoid drawing the predator's attention. Even Professor Benjamin was shrinking back. his protective instincts overwhelmed by Gideon's terrifying display of dominance. Then, Abigail looked down at her own hands. She remembered the dry creek bed in the Wasatch Mountains. She remembered the smell of pine needles, the hot breath of the cougar, and the terrifying electric realization that if she didn't fight, she would die. She remembered the sheer, unadulterated rage that had flooded her veins, a survival mechanism baked into human DNA through millions of years of brutal evolution on a world that constantly tried to kill them. Sorry, Dad, Abigail thought. She reached down to her ankles and unclasped the heavy magnetic kinetic dampeners. Clack, clack. She pulled the dampeners off her wrists. Clack, clack. Without the extra 80 pounds of resistance, and under the incredibly weak 0.4 gravity of the Academy, Abigail suddenly felt impossibly light. She felt like she was floating. Gideon brought his foot down. Abigail moved. To the alien students in the room, it looked like a magic trick. 1 second, the fragile little earthling was sitting in the back row. The next, she was a blur of motion. Human muscle tissue, dense and coiled like steel wire from battling Earth's gravity, unleashed its full kinetic potential. She didn't just run. She launched herself over the rows of desks, clearing a 10-foot gap in a single bound. Just as Gideon's foot was about to crush Simon's windpipe, a small, pale mass collided with the 9-foot alien's chest. Abigail didn't hit him with her fists. She knew human bones could break against his chitinous plating. Instead, she used her entire body weight, combined with the velocity of her jump, and drove her elbow directly into the soft cluster of nerve endings just beneath Gideon's primary sternum, a weak point she had noted during a tedious anatomy lecture 3 weeks prior. The impact sounded like a cannon firing. Gideon's eyes bugged out. All the air was forcefully expelled from his dual lungs in a violent whoosh. The massive 9-foot-tall apex predator was lifted entirely off his feet. He flew backward over a desk, crashing violently into the opposite wall and collapsing into a heap of tangled limbs and desks. The silence in classroom 4B was absolute. It was a profound, suffocating quiet, broken only by the sound of Simon's labored breathing and the gentle hum of the ventilation system. Abigail landed gracefully on her feet, the low gravity making her movements fluid and terrifyingly precise. She didn't assume a martial arts stance. She didn't shout a battle cry. She simply stood there, brushing a stray lock of ash-blonde hair out of her eyes, her chest rising and falling with slow, controlled breaths. Every single alien in the room stared at her in abject, mind-shattering horror. The frail, soft flesh bag from the back row had just thrown the school's most dangerous predator across the room like a discarded toy. Slowly, Gideon groaned. He pushed himself up from the wreckage of the desk, his forearms shaking. The feral rage in his eyes hadn't dissipated. It had multiplied. He looked at Abigail, wiping a smear of dark saliva from his jagged jaw. "You," Gideon hissed, his voice vibrating with a lethal promise. "You are dead, little flesh bag." Abigail reached up and calmly took off her thick-rimmed glasses, folding them neatly and placing them on a nearby desk. She looked at Gideon, her hazel eyes completely devoid of fear. In that moment, the mountain lion from her past seemed like a much scarier opponent than the overgrown lizard standing before her. "Class is in session, Gideon," Abigail said, her voice eerily calm, ringing out clearly in the silent room. "Sit down." Gideon did not sit down. Instead, the 9-foot-tall reptilian let out a sound that defied the standard auditory range of the translation matrix. A grating, subharmonic rumble that vibrated through the floorboards and rattled the reinforced glass of the classroom windows. The toxic purple hue of his dorsal ridges flared with renewed, venomous intensity. He lunged. To the alien students watching in paralyzed terror, Gideon's speed was legendary. His species, native to a high-oxygen jungle world, were ambush predators capable of closing a 20-foot gap in a fraction of a second. But to Abigail Miller, whose nervous system was currently being flooded with a massive evolutionary dose of human adrenaline, he looked like he was moving underwater. Earth's gravity was 2.5 times stronger than the standard pull of the Apex Interstellar Academy. For her entire life, Abigail had been carrying the invisible weight of a class, 9 Death World, Her bones were incredibly dense, her muscle fibers woven tight and coiled for explosive output. Taking off her kinetic dampeners was like dropping a heavy backpack after a 10-mile hike uphill. As Gideon's upper right arm swung in a devastating arc aimed at her skull, Abigail didn't try to block it. A direct parry against an opponent with 3 times her mass would result in shattered forearms. Instead, she pivoted on her left heel, letting the massive, clawed fist sail harmlessly past her cheek. The force of his missed punch carried a slipstream of displaced air that ruffled her ash-blonde hair. Before Gideon could retract his arm or bring his other 3 limbs to bear, Abigail stepped directly into his guard. She remembered the self-defense classes her father, William, had insisted she take back in Orem. "Leverage, Abby," he had told her, standing in their dusty barn. "You're never going to be the biggest person in the room, but physics doesn't care about size. It cares about force, mass, and acceleration." Abigail drove the heel of her boot directly into the side of Gideon's primary knee joint. The structural anatomy of a bipedal creature, regardless of its planetary origin, usually relied on a hinge mechanism to support its upright mass. Gideon was no different. The dense rubber and reinforced composite of Abigail's footwear, propelled by leg muscles conditioned to squat under Earth gravity, struck the joint with the kinetic equivalent of a swinging sledgehammer. A sickening pop echoed through the room. Gideon roared, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony rather than rage as his leg buckled sideways. His massive weight pitched forward. But the alien was an apex predator for a reason. Even as he fell, his survival instincts flared. His lower left arm whipped out, the thick, scaly fingers wrapping around Abigail's waist like a vice. He squeezed, intending to crush her ribs and snap her spine before he hit the ground. For the first time, a jolt of genuine panic spiked through Abigail's chest. The pressure was immense, a crushing constriction that immediately forced the air from her lungs. She felt the heavy canvas of her academy uniform tear, the sharp points of his claws digging into her flesh. "Fight!" her brain screamed. Humans possessed a biological trait entirely unique among the known galactic species: hysterical strength. When faced with imminent death, the human brain could entirely bypass the safety limiters placed on its muscular system, allowing individuals to lift burning cars off trapped children or fight off apex predators with bare hands. The cost was severe muscle tearing and exhaustion, but the immediate result was a terrifying burst of kinetic output. Abigail gritted her teeth, ignoring the blinding pain in her ribs. She twisted her upper body, wrapping her own arms around Gideon's thick, scaly forearm. With a guttural shout, she planted her feet, arched her back, and used her entire core strength to torque her body against his grip. To the absolute disbelief of Professor Benjamin and the 30 students watching, the human girl bent the alien's massive arm backward. The dense, hyper-oxygenated muscles of the reptilian strained, but they could not match the sheer, dense mechanical leverage of the Deathworlder. Gideon's grip broke. Free from his hold, Abigail didn't retreat. She capitalized on his collapsed posture. As Gideon knelt on his shattered knee, his head was perfectly leveled with her chest. She stepped in, wrapping her arms around his thick, scaly neck in a textbook rear-naked chokehold. Gideon thrashed wildly. His remaining 3 arms clawed at her, scoring deep, bloody scratches across her forearms and shoulders. He slammed his body backward, trying to crush her against the desks, but the 0.4 gravity worked against him. Abigail simply clamped her legs around his torso, becoming an immovable, parasitic weight attached to his back. She squeezed. On Earth, a chokehold didn't rely on crushing the windpipe. It relied on compressing the carotid arteries, cutting off the blood supply to the brain. Abigail didn't know the exact cardiovascular layout of Gideon's species, but she knew that a brain, any brain, needed oxygenated blood to function. She locked her arms together, burying her face against the back of his thick plated neck to protect her eyes, and applied maximum pressure. 10 seconds passed. Gideon's thrashing became frantic, violent spasms that destroyed 2 more rows of desks. 20 seconds. The violent bucking slowed. The toxic purple of his dorsal ridges began to fade to a dull, sickly gray. 30 seconds. Gideon's 4 arms went limp, dropping heavily to the floor. His massive body slumped forward, completely unconscious. Abigail held the choke for exactly 3 more seconds to ensure he wasn't faking it, then released him. She pushed herself off his back, landing softly on the debris-covered floor. Her chest heaved as her lungs desperately sucked in the conditioned air of the classroom. Her uniform was torn. Her forearms were bleeding from a dozen shallow claw marks, and her ribs ached with a dull, throbbing intensity. She looked around the room. Professor Benjamin was pressed flat against his desk, his multiple eyes wide with a terror he could not articulate. Chloe, the insectoid, was trembling so violently her wings were producing a high-pitched hum. Simon, still bleeding on the floor, stared at her as if she had just grown a second head. The silence was deafening. Slowly, methodically, Abigail walked over to where she had dropped her kinetic dampeners. She picked up the heavy metal bands. Clack, clack. She fastened them around her ankles. Clack, clack. She locked them around her wrists. The familiar, crushing weight returned, grounding her. She picked up her folded glasses from the nearby desk, slipped them back onto her face, and turned to Professor Benjamin. "Professor," Abigail said, her voice slightly raspy but impeccably polite. "I believe Simon requires immediate medical attention." Before the elderly alien could respond, the heavy, reinforced doors of Classroom 4B hissed open. 4 heavily armored Academy wardens, members of a quadrupedal, heavily shielded security species, stormed into the room, their stun rifles raised and charged. They froze. The scene before them defied every protocol in their training manuals. The Academy's most aggressive apex predator was lying unconscious and broken among shattered desks. And standing over him, adjusting her glasses and bleeding quietly, was the fragile little exchange student from the Sol system. "Drop your weapons," the lead warden barked, his localized voice cracking with confusion. "Identify the threat." Abigail slowly raised her hands, the heavy metal of her dampeners catching the fluorescent light. "There is no threat, Warden," she said softly. "The situation has been resolved." The administrative holding cell was a stark, brilliantly white room, devoid of any corners, designed to keep volatile species calm. Abigail sat on a seamless, contoured bench in the center of the room. A medical drone hovered near her right shoulder, projecting a soft blue light over the claw marks on her arms. It applied a stinging, translucent dermal sealant to the wounds, but Abigail barely felt it. Her mind was thousands of light years away, back in the sprawling, dusty fields of Orem, Utah. She was doing the math. The Interstellar Exchange Scholarship was worth 2 million galactic credits. The debt held by Harrison and Caldwell, the predatory firm currently breathing down her father's neck, was roughly 1.2 million. Her mother's upcoming series of spinal surgeries at Utah Valley Hospital would run them another 500,000. "I lost it," she thought, staring blankly at the pristine white floor. "I lost the farm. I lost Mom's treatment. I fought back, and I ruined everything." She pulled her knees to her chest, the heavy kinetic dampeners clinking together. The adrenaline that had fueled her survival was crashing, leaving behind a cold, hollow wave of exhaustion and despair. She had allowed her primitive instincts to override her mission. She had beaten a fellow student unconscious. The Earth liaison had been crystal clear. Any violence meant immediate expulsion. The door hissed open. Director Hayes walked in. The localized name hardly fit his appearance. He was a towering figure, an elegant hybrid of avian and reptilian genetics, draped in the flowing, ceremonial robes of the Academy's highest office. His feathers were a brilliant iridescent silver, and his eyes were sharp, calculating pools of liquid obsidian. Behind him followed Ambassador Richard Davis, the Earth diplomatic liaison. Richard was a tall, graying man in a sharply tailored charcoal suit. He looked incredibly pale, clutching a glowing datapad as if it were a life preserver. Abigail immediately stood up, ignoring the throbbing pain in her ribs. "Director Hayes, Ambassador Davis. Sit down, Miss Miller," Director Hayes interrupted, his voice smooth and melodic, yet carrying an undeniable weight of authority. Abigail sat. Richard Davis stepped forward, looking at her with a mixture of profound relief and utter disbelief. "Abby, are you all right? The medical log said you sustained localized tissue damage and microfractures in your left costal cartilage." "I'm fine, sir," Abigail said quietly, keeping her eyes fixed on the floor. "It's just bruising." "Ambassador, I am so sorry. I know the rules. I know what I did." "Please, Just tell me how much the penalty fine is. If they give us a few months, my dad can sell the northern acreage. And maybe. Miss Miller, Director Hayes interrupted again, stepping into her field of vision. He folded his long, elegant hands behind his back. Do you understand what occurred in classroom 4B today? I was attacked, Abigail said, her voice trembling slightly. No, wait. Simon was attacked. Gideon was going to kill him. I intervened. I used excessive force. I broke his leg and rendered him unconscious. I accept full responsibility for my actions. Director Hayes tilted his head, his obsidian eyes blinking slowly. You believe you are here to be expelled, aren't I? Abigail looked up, a tear finally breaking free and tracking through the dust and dried blood on her cheek. The contract stated that any physical altercation initiated or escalated by the human representative would result in the revocation of the stipend. Director Hayes turned to Ambassador Davis. Richard, your people possess a fascinating psychological complex. You hide your true nature behind a veil of perceived fragility, and when that nature is revealed, you apologize for it. Richard cleared his throat, adjusting his tie nervously. Director, as I explained, Earth's evolutionary history is complicated. We sent Abigail because her psychological profile indicated high levels of restraint and empathy. We did not intend to deceive the Academy. Deceive? Director Hayes let out a soft, trilling laugh that echoed strangely in the sterile room. Ambassador, you have not deceived us. You have entirely redefined our understanding of the soul system. Hayes tapped a command on his wrist console, and a holographic projection flared to life in the center of the room. It displayed the biometric readouts from Classroom 4B during the incident. When humanity applied for integration into the galactic community, Hayes explained, pacing slowly around the hologram, your biological data was heavily redacted. You claimed it was for planetary security. We assumed it was out of embarrassment. Your species lacks natural armor, venom, claws, or redundant organs. You require a highly specific atmospheric mixture and possess a terrifyingly short lifespan. He pointed a long, silver-taloned finger at the hologram. But we did not account for the sheer density of your musculoskeletal structure, necessitated by your planet's absurd gravitational pull. We did not account for your endocrine system. When Gideon attacked, your body produced a chemical cocktail epinephrine, cortisol, dopamine, in quantities that would cause catastrophic heart failure in any other known species. It acted as a temporary, biological hyperdrive. He was going to crush Simon's neck, Abigail whispered, her hands balling into fists on her lap. I didn't think about my endocrine system. I just stopped him. And that, Hayes said, leaning in closely, is the crux of the matter. You stopped him. You did not kill him. Abigail blinked. Of course I didn't kill him. I'm not a murderer. Miss Miller, Hayes said softly, the melodic tone of his voice dropping to a serious hum. In Gideon's culture, a challenge of dominance between apex predators ends in death. Always. To leave an opponent alive after entirely dismantling their physical superiority is not viewed as weakness. It is viewed as the ultimate humiliating display of supreme dominance. You proved that you could end his life effortlessly, and chose not to, treating him as a creature beneath your lethal consideration. Abigail's jaw dropped. She looked at Richard Davis, desperate for a translation of the politics being spoken. Abby, Richard said, his voice thick with awe. The footage of the incident was automatically uploaded to the central disciplinary servers. It was reviewed by the Board of Governors, and it was reviewed by Gideon's father, High Warlord Vaxizildan of the Draconis sector. Abigail's blood ran cold. A High Warlord. Now she had doomed Earth to an intergalactic war. I can apologize to him. I can. You will do no such thing, Richard said sharply, though a massive grin was fighting to break through his professional demeanor. Abby, High Warlord Vaxildan just sent an official diplomatic envoy to my office. He didn't demand your expulsion. He demanded to know why we hid our true warrior caste from the galaxy. Warrior caste? Abigail repeated, completely lost. I'm a 16-year-old farm girl from Utah. To them, you are a Deathworlder who casually incapacitated a Draconis Alpha without using lethal force, Director Hayes said. He dismissed the hologram with a wave of his hand. The Board of Governors convened an emergency session 30 minutes ago. The charge against you for excessive force has been formally dropped, citing the Intervention in Defense of a Pacifist Species Clause. Abigail's heart stuttered. Dropped? I'm not expelled? Quite the contrary, Director Hayes said, his obsidian eyes gleaming. Your actions saved the life of the son of an agri-world senator. Simon's family has already petitioned the Academy to officially recognize your bravery. Humanity's political standing in the Orion Spur just jumped forward by a century. Abigail sank back against the wall, the adrenaline finally leaving her system completely. She was safe. The scholarship was safe. The farm in Orem was safe. Her mother would get her surgeries. A massive, shuddering breath escaped her lips. However, Director Hayes said, his tone shifting, becoming distinctly ominous. There is a new complication, Miss Miller. One that you and Ambassador Davis must navigate carefully. Abigail looked up, the brief moment of relief evaporating. What complication? You are no longer a ghost, Abigail, Director Hayes warned. You are no longer the fragile little exchange student in the back row. You have proven yourself to be a highly dangerous, incredibly dense apex predator from a Class 9 death world. By defeating Gideon, you have inadvertently claimed his status within the student hierarchy. Richard Davis nodded grimly. He's right, Abby. The apex species at this academy respect power above all else. You just proved you have it. Director Hayes turned toward the door, his silver robes whispering against the floor. He paused and looked back at her over his shoulder. Until today, they ignored you because they thought you were prey, Hayes said softly. Tomorrow, when you walk into the cafeteria, they will not ignore you. They will be watching you. Some will seek your protection. Others will seek to test exactly how much it takes to break a human. The next morning, the grand cafeteria of the Apex Interstellar Academy was a cacophony of alien chatter, clinking synthetic cutlery, and the low hum of the station's atmospheric scrubbers. It was a sprawling, multi-leveled chamber constructed from spun glass and brushed titanium, designed to comfortably feed 2,000 students from 60 different worlds. Then, the main doors hissed open, and Abigail Miller walked in. The silence did not fall instantly. It rippled outward like a shockwave, spreading across a calm lake. First, the students near the entrance stopped talking, their various ocular organs fixing on the small, pale girl in the fresh, neatly pressed gray uniform. Then the silence spread to the center tables, and finally to the upper balconies. Within 10 seconds, the only sound in the massive hall was the heavy, rhythmic clack, clack, clack of Abigail's kinetic dampeners striking the polished floor. Yesterday, those heavy metal bracelets had been viewed as medical braces, a pathetic crutch for a crippled prey animal. Today, every student in the room recognized them for what they truly were, restraining bolts. They were the only things keeping the terrifying, dense, gravity demon from breaking the sound barrier and tearing them apart. Abigail kept her eyes forward, adjusting her thick-rimmed glasses. She was exhausted, her ribs aching fiercely beneath her uniform. But she remembered Ambassador Davis's warning. She could not show weakness. She walked with her shoulders back, channeling every ounce of stubborn resilience she had inherited from her father, William. As she approached the food synthesizers, the crowd literally parted. Arthur, the massive 8-foot avian who had laughed at her a month prior, hastily stepped backward, knocking over his own chair to get out of her way. Chloe, the insectoid, pressed herself flat against a glass pillar, her antennae plastered to her skull in a submissive posture. Abigail selected her nutrient paste and turned around, holding her tray. Directly in the center of the room sat the elevated, crystalline table reserved for the alpha of the sector. For 3 years it had been Gideon's throne. Today it was empty. Standing nervously beside it was Simon. The gentle herbivore had a thick layer of medical foam wrapped around his bruised snout, but he was standing tall. When Abigail met his gaze, Simon did not look away. Instead, he bowed his massive armored head, a gesture of absolute respect, and pulled out the central chair. He was offering her the throne. Abigail hesitated. She didn't want to be a warlord. She just wanted to pass calculus, save her family's farm in Orem, and go home. But as she looked at the terrified faces of the other students, she realized that power in the galaxy wasn't something you could politely decline. If you didn't hold it, someone like Gideon would. She walked to the center of the room, stepped up onto the elevated platform, and sat down. A collective breath was released throughout the cafeteria. The hierarchy had been settled. Humanity was no longer a cosmic joke. They were the apex. Later that evening, sitting in the quiet solitude of her dorm room, Abigail activated her encrypted datapad. The screen flickered, and the tired, deeply lined face of her father appeared. William Miller looked like he hadn't slept in a week, but as he saw her face, his eyes lit up. "Abby?" William breathed, his voice thick with emotion. "Are you okay?" Ambassador Davis called me. "He said there was an incident." "I'm okay, Dad," Abigail smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached her eyes. "Just a minor disagreement in xenodynamics. Nothing I couldn't handle." William wiped a hand across his face, laughing in disbelief. "Well, whatever you did, the bank called this morning. The Central Terrestrial Government just deposited the 2 million credits. Harrison and Caldwell dropped the foreclosure. It's done, Abby. The farm is ours. And Dr. Christopher at Utah Valley Hospital, he scheduled your mother for her first spinal surgery this Thursday." Abigail pressed her hand against the screen, tears of pure relief finally spilling over her eyelashes. She had done it. She had survived the predators, the gravity, and the impossible odds. "Tell Mom I love her," Abigail whispered, "and tell her I'm doing fine in school, making a few new friends." She closed the connection, the screen fading to black. Abigail looked out the viewport of her dorm, staring at the brilliant, swirling nebulas of the Orion Spur. She was still just a human exchange student from Utah. But to the rest of the galaxy, Abigail Miller was a terrifying promise. Earth was a world of monsters, and they fiercely protected their own. Did Abigail's incredible display of human strength against the galactic bullies leave you cheering for Earth? If you loved this HFY sci-fi story of survival, leverage, and proving the galaxy wrong, smash that like button. Don't forget to share this tale with your fellow Deathworlders and subscribe to the channel for more epic sci-fi audio dramas. What alien species should humanity humble next? Let us know below.